Christelle Nadia Fotso, second podcast of March. And I wanted to talk to you at last about my dad, Victor Fotso. He always preferred to be called Fotso Victor because for him, the European name didn't really matter. And he wasn't born um, Victor. That's the name he chose when he converted to Catholicism. So he never really felt that his name, even though he believed in the Catholic religion, was his name because he wasn't really born with that name. The name that his mother chose for him, that his parents chose for him, was Fotso. So I wanted to talk to you about him to make an important point about African capitalism, African excellence. My dad's story is not well known, not only outside of Cameroon, a little bit in Central Africa. That says a lot about the way people view Africa. People think that it's always a question of poverty, that it's impossible that there can be great stories of wealth, great example of wealth in Africa. People think that most, even all, Africans are poor or dreaming of going away in Western countries to basically do something with their life to survive. People think that Africans most of the time are dependent. People have so many preconceptions about Cameroon, Africa. And the first episode of the English version of my podcast was titled Fotso Matters. It's because that story matters. It's a story that shows that Africa matters, that African lives matter, and that even before colonization, Africans were already doing great things. In Francophone Africa, we still have in mind, I'm including myself in the we because I was born in Cameroon. So we always have in mind what the French President Sarkozy said when he came to Dakar in Senegal and said, the African men, the African people have never really entered his history, as if we were waiting for, and here I'm talking again, I'm including, again, here I'm including myself in the we because I was born in Cameroon. Make the argument about Africa, about poverty, always thinking that Africans are needy, Africans are all future migrants. Africans dream of going to exile elsewhere to be able to survive, to be able to do anything great. They have to go to European countries or elsewhere. My dad's story always comes to mind to show that, to remind me, even when I have doubts, that anything is possible. So who was Fotso Victor? Who was Victor Fotso? My dad was born around 1926. The reason why we say around 1926 is because we don't know when he was born. He doesn't know when his birthday was. But that wasn't abnormal at that time because he wasn't born in a city. He was born in a village called Bandjoun around 1926. So he was born in a place that has a huge importance in what we call Cameroon, but the Bamileke country, the grass fields. And his parents were very, very poor. His mother was an orphan. And even if his parents had dreamed that he was going to be great, they would have never dreamed that he was going to become Fotso Victor, that he was going to become one of the first industrialist, one of the first industrialist example of African capitalism that he became. They would have never dreamt that because he had no chance. Statistically, he had no chance. There weren't really schools at the time. Um, in that um, in that time, kids were not really expected to go to school. Kids were just it's expected to become farmers or to follow what their dad was doing. My dad's dad, my grandfather, had many wives. My grandmother was very, very, um, as they would say, and are still saying, stubborn. Um, she wasn't really one of the favorite. My grandmother was one of those wives that was not really accepted because she was very, very stubborn. She was tall. She was very, very beautiful, but she was very, very stubborn. And my dad, as her firstborn and her first son, stops going to school because he needs to help his mother to help her raise his younger siblings. My grandfather um, wasn't very enthusiastic about my dad going to school. He felt that it was the Western um, education and that it was unimportant for the village, and that all that the French colonizers were going to teach the local kids were how to be docile, to be good servants of the colonial state. So my grandfather was against it. So when my father learns to go to the market to sell things to help his mother, he does that for a while, and then he decides that the only way to make something of himself. So the only chance that he had to make something of himself was to get out of Bandjoun, his village, and to go to a city where there were more opportunities. His first choice was Douala. Douala was the town where most people from the grass fields were going. It was a very, very popular destination for ambitious people of the grass fields. But he can't because you need an authorization. He tries several times, but he cannot. The second choice was Yaoundé, but it was very, very difficult because it's the capital. The third choice was Mbalmayo, where there was a lot of Greeks at the time. So there was a lot, also very huge Bamileke population. My dad is a Bamileke. So he goes to Mbalmayo without authorization. He basically cheats. There was a lot of administrative roadblocks to basically make sure that the rebellion in the grass field was not taking over all of Cameroon. So anyway, my dad goes to Balmayo. He starts by selling nuts, matches, and he's great with people. He can read people. He can't read a book, he can't read a newspaper, but he can read a person. And he's very, very good with numbers. And as a lot of people from the grass field, he's very, very good with business. So he starts small, very, very small. And he does everything by himself. He learns to knit. He's a buy and seller of small merchants who buy things and resell them. He starts there. But because he's very, very good with people, he makes friends. He makes friends. And in 1956, a French man named Pierre Castel comes to Balmayo with a lot of wine that he's trying to sell. And he asks around to see if there's anybody from the local population who can help him sell the wine. And somebody says, you have to talk to Victor Fotso. That's the way my dad and Pierre Castel, who's one of the wealthiest people in France, meet. And the rest is history. They become friends. And later on, when my dad goes for the first time in France, it's because Pierre Castel invites him. And he invites him not to Paris, but to Bordeaux. So that's the way it starts. Right? That starts very, very slowly. The people who are trying to delegitimize my dad thinks that he got a lot of, government contract and became wealthy all of a sudden. It was a very slow process. Small merchants, rich businessmen, and then industrialists. Gastel played a great role because it made it possible for him to have partners in Europe by knowing Pierre Gastel. He has businesses in Cameroon, in all over Central Africa. The state is letting most of its merchandise get out of Cameroon. He gets out of Balmayo. He's able to go to Yaoundé, to Douala. He started going back and forth in Europe. He was even selling wine in Barcelona in the 60s in Barcelona, my favorite city. Yeah. So that's the way it starts. It starts because he's very good with people and because he's able to partner with a Frenchman named Jacques. He, you know, Jacques Lacombe, who's a French and who knows a lot about the technical side of how you build an industry. You have to imagine this African man who can't read, who can't write, but who can read people with those Western people who are always thinking of Africans as inferior. We were in the 60s and the 70s at the time, and even the 80s. So they see my dad and they always underestimate him because he was always underestimated because he didn't speak French very, very well. He's able to make great deals and to even take advantage of the fact that he's underestimated. Fotso Victor signed all type of contracts with people from France, Denmark, China, all over the world. But he never knew how to read any of those contracts. But he felt things and he could read people. And during those times, your word was your bond. If you said you were going to do something, you followed through. Like that, his word, that was his reputation. People were signing contracts, but what mattered is the verbal agreement, the oral contract. So my dad was very, very good at that. So that's the way, he became a legend. He was one of the first indigenous guy to buy a huge commercial center mall in Balmayo. You know, he has done amazing thing. He had was making beer, selling notebooks, matches, all type of things. So that's how he becomes very, very rich. Businesses everywhere. He gets out of Cameroon. He goes to Western Africa. China becomes a huge part of his business. But then the political, the politics, caught up with my dad. At the beginning of the 90s, so there's a lot of um, turbulent political times in Cameroon, and my dad has to become involved. It's the situation is so tense and so unstable that people who were wealthy had to become political figures. So my dad had basically no choice. There was no way he could escape it, and he knew that. He knew that when he became one of the wealthiest people in the region, that there was no way he could get out of politics. There was no way. And given the fact that a lot of his businesses depended on the state, given his past, there was no way he could choose another side than the side of the President Paul Biya. People disagree, feel that he made the wrong choice, that he could have made another choice. I feel that it was the only choice he could make, given who he was, given the fact that Bandjoun, where he was born, his village, meant a lot for him. So that's Victor Fotso, a man who can't read, can't write, born around 1926 in a village where there was no electricity, where there were no school at the time. Schools came later. Schools came later. He's able to become very, very wealthy. He has to become political. But then, as always in those stories, there's a question of succession. There's a question of what comes after. Because he's a traditional Bamileke man from the grass field of Cameroon. He has a lot of wives, so that means a lot of kids. When you have a lot of wives, a lot of kids, and then there's a lot of money, trouble is not far away. In my dad, it was the case. But he had a son that I will talk to you more after, who anticipates what is about to come and becomes even more political than him in order to become the successor, in order to get the support of the state. And it works because that son, who's already managing a good part of the business, who's the vice president of my dad's business group. So my dad's succession was destined to fail, given the fact that the state and other people, not only in Cameroon, but he had so much money that there was no way people weren't going to try to put their hands on it. Yes, he had people who was managing his fortune, but none of it worked. The fact that he can't read or write, that he's an African man, becomes obstacle to succession, for the wealth of my dad to last more than one generation. It was very, very difficult because so many people got involved. So when he dies, March 19, 2020, dies alone. And the state, Cameroon, has forgotten about him. They have made him, they have transformed him from a hero, an example of African excellence, the epitome of African excellence, of African capitalism. He has just become a political man, a man who was the mayor of his village, Bandjoun. So that's the story. And Miente, this episode is to show you that great African stories exist. There are a lot of them out there. Those type of stories, stories of people who were born before colonial time, who did amazing things, not only in French Africa, but in Africa, period. But because African history is always looked at from the gaze of non-African, more often than not, they are forgotten, or their histories change, or people always delegitimize, exotize, make it exotic who they are, so that it's possible for people who should know better to say it doesn't matter. This story doesn't matter. In my dad's case, not to talk about what has happened to him, not even to acknowledge what he has done. People always talk about the fact that he had many wives, that he had many kids, that he's guilty of that, and that there's nothing that we can say about it. That's why I'm talking about this story. What is revolting is the number of people who have no respect for what this man has done. Number of people who have no respect for what Fotso Victor did, who are able to just poo-poo it as if it was easy, as if it was impossible, as if he was just somebody who stole a lot of money. It's amazing that in the time of Elon Musk, who was born in South Africa, who's doing what he's doing, people are able to poo-poo Fotso Victor's story and not to know about it. not to know about it, and to solely talk about him when you need to talk about his kids, when you need to talk about his wives, about the exotic, as if to make fun of Africa, to belittle Africa, to belittle African stories, instead of talking about the hard work, the courage, the character that you need to have to become Fotso Victor when you don't know how to read and when you don't know how to write, when you can't speak French in Francophone Africa. That is revolting to me. And the way he dies at the American hospital of Paris is revolting. And the fact that nobody cares, that people are able to say, oh my God, that's his fault. It's always the African fault, the African man or the African woman's fault. We're always guilty of something, even when we are victims. They're always going to say, oh my God, he looked for it. He was too African. He was too uppity. Too many wives, too many kids. Instead of saying, how can such a thing happen to a man as great and that nobody, not even Cameroonian officials, not even his friends, the people who took money from him, not even his French lawyers protected him, not even his wealth managers, people who knew about how much money he had, did something. So no, people just talk about the money to basically make this another sad and unimportant African stories that just show that Africans are weird. We're not disciplined. We can't do wealth. We can't do successions. We can't transmit, build a fortune where it goes from generation to generation to generations. Fotso Victor did it, but yet he was a victim of his Africanness and of the times where not only in Cameroon, but in France and elsewhere, it's possible to say, it doesn't matter. We don't need to investigate. We don't need to know the story. We don't need to even be curious. We don't need to dig a little deeper to understand how can such a thing happen to such a great African in France, in Neuilly, close to Paris. And nobody does anything because they're able to focus on the exotic, to say, too many wives, too many kids. Savagery, African savagery, savages is so important. So, Miente, one of the goals is to tell the story. It's to show why it matters. It's to show that it matters. And to convince you to care just enough to want to know more about it, to want to know more about Fotso Victor, and to want to know more about me, his daughter, Christelle Nadia Fotso. What has happened? African legend. His physically challenged daughter, who's just stubborn as hell, who refuses to give up. My responsibility is to tell the story and to make it at last audible, and for people to, yes, hear me. The fact that a great man, an African legend, can be abused in the American hospital of Paris so that people can put their hands on his fortune, on his wealth, doesn't matter in 2025 means that African lives don't matter. And niente, again, my bet is that you will conclude the more you know about Fotso Victor, that African lives matter, that Fotso matters, and that disability matters. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Don't forget to follow my channel, and I will see you next Tuesday for another episode. Thank you, guys.